Well, like usual, I will say good evening to you. Hope everyone's having a good week so far. I invite you to take your Bibles and turn with us to the book of Luke. We'll go ahead and go to Luke chapter 1. We won't cover tons of verses this evening because what we really want to do is offer somewhat of an introduction to the book that I hope you will find beneficial and useful as we study the book of Luke. Before we do that, I want to say thank you to Steve for that well-worded prayer, but specifically, Steve, for mentioning all of those individuals by name. I think that's important because they aren't just people in a bulletin. They're people that we love and care about, and though we may not know all of them, all of us, like you said, someone here knows, I guess, everyone in that bulletin, and so the idea that Christians are praying for you, that's a powerful sentiment. And the idea that even Christians that are a part of our church family who cannot be here, like our shut-ins, how that they know that we're here thinking of them, praying about them, mentioning them by name, that's got to be encouraging to them, and I hope that we continue in that practice. I would ask, if you will, to add somebody in my family to your prayer list. You may have heard me reference my cousin and best friend, who is a fellow preacher who preaches down in Georgia. His mom is the sister of my mom, and she passed away this past week. So my Aunt Sherry passed away. And my grandmother, who many of you have heard me speak of, she had 5 children, and that was the only one living. And so my grandmother has now outlived all 5 of her children. They have all died before their time, including my mom. And I ask you to pray for her 2 sons, my cousin Art, who preaches in Georgia, and his little brother, my cousin Keith, who preaches in Cleveland, Tennessee, at the North Bradley Church of Christ. And so pray for that family. But I'd also ask that you'd pray for my grandmother, Barbara Sloan, because I couldn't even imagine losing 5 children. My mother was the first to pass away in 2007, and they've all passed away now, and my heart breaks for her. So please keep my family in your prayers. I'll be over there, or down there in the Inglewood area Friday, helping with the funeral service. But pray for that family as well as all these other names. All right, so the book of Luke is actually, I don't know if I knew this. I don't know how long I've known this, but it hasn't been too awful long. But the book of Luke is the longest book of the New Testament. And we're speaking we're not speaking in chapters or necessarily verses. We're talking about word count. So Luke is the longest book in all the New Testament. If you were to read the book of Luke all in one setting, I'm saying sit down and begin it and read it until it's completed, it would take about 2 to 2.5 hours to read the book of Luke. Now, when I hear that, my mind goes to, I've got book lovers in my life. I do many things, maybe not so much read for fun. I'm more of a read for learning type of person. But I do many things in my life that take up 2.5 hours or more. That's really not that long of a time to do something. You know, for instance, if I sat down and watch a football game this Saturday, how long is your typical football game? About 3.5 hours, right? And so it takes me an hour more to sit through a football game, and sometimes those things are painful, aren't they, Vols fans? And if an hour longer to do that than it would take to sit down and read the entirety of the book of Luke in one setting. And so that's the longest book of the New Testament. Now, the second longest book of the New Testament by word count happens to be the book of Acts. And you probably already know, though we'll get into it this evening, that the one who wrote Acts also wrote Luke. Luke wrote both. And that means that Luke has written more of the New Testament than any other Bible writer. And we want to give that title to Paul because he wrote the most books, but you know how small most of his letters were. And so Luke wrote about 27% of the New Testament. Paul wrote about 23% of the New Testament, Luke just edging him out. That's a whole lot of material that has been written down by Luke, but we'll get into that in just a moment. And so, yes, it takes about 2.5 hours to read the book of Luke. In truth, I don't really know that's to read the book of Luke. In truth, I really don't know how long it's going to take us to study the book of Luke. This is the first time I've ever taught the book of Luke. I've taught, I've taught big books of the Bible like the book of Genesis, and I remember covering that in 2 years, and I've also taught that where it took 4 years. I've taught, when we were in Florida, I taught the life of Christ, but I have never sat down with a congregation and taught the book of Luke by itself. So I'm looking forward to that as we do this. I don't know how long it's going to take, but here's what I do know. It's going to be time well spent. If it's 2.5 hours to sit down and read the longest book of the New Testament, or it's 2.5 years studying the longest book of the New Testament, I'm not saying that to be a realistic time, but what I'm saying is I don't know how long it might take to study it, but I do know it's going to be time well spent, because in studying the book of Luke, it is an opportunity for us to get to know Jesus better. And really, that's the foundation of growing in our faith, is getting to know Jesus better. What is the foundation of the church? Jesus said, "Upon this rock I will build my church." What was the rock? It was the confession that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of the living God. The foundation of the church is Christ. The foundation of my faith is Christ. When the Ethiopian eunuch was taught about the gospel and later baptized and became a Christian, what's the wording of the text? That beginning at this scripture, Philip preached, what's it say? Christ to him, Jesus to him. And so it's as simple as Jesus and understanding the life and ministry and the works and the teaching of Jesus is literally everything when it comes down to building our faith. And so I can't think of a better way to spend our time, however much time it may take, than to study the Scriptures. And so to get the most out of our study together, I do think it's worth taking a little bit of time and investigating some introductory questions. 4 major questions that I think are always important before studying a book of the Bible. Number 1, who wrote it? Number 2, when was it written? Number 3, to whom was it written? Who was the audience? And number 4, for what purpose was it written? To me, those are kind of the questions that are helpful. Can I just jump right into Luke chapter 1 and verse 1 and get a lot out of Luke? Yes, but I would suggest by taking a little bit of time at the outset to answer these introductory questions gives us a better background, gives us better context, gives us better perspective, that allows us to get even more out of the study with the effort and time we put into it in the days and weeks and months to come. And so I don't want this to turn into a multiple weeks of covering introductory material. So what I'm going to do is give you the material I have prepared rather quickly, and hopefully if you have any questions of clarification or observations, you can share those with me either at the end of class or after class is over, because I don't want to turn this into multiple weeks of introductory material in the book of Luke. And so we start with question number 1, who wrote the book of Luke? And you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's an easy one, preacher. The question is given right there on the title page. I mean, whoever wrote the book of Luke is written by Luke. How do you know that? Because Luke is the name that's in the title of the book, right? And I know that's an observation, and I know that that's really where our mind goes to. We just trust that the Luke at the top of the page is the correct answer. And you know this without me having to tell you, so I'm not insulting your intelligence. I acknowledge it's something you already know. But you know the title of Bible books, in the original copies of Bible letters and Bible books, there were no titles. There just wasn't. Really, no book of the Bible that we know of was given with the information and plus a title. So what that leads us to conclude is that the title at the top of the page, on the first page of a Bible book, it is not inspired. Okay, it is not inspired. And actually, you will see that it varies from time to time. Sometimes you'll see that it's called Luke. Sometimes you'll see it's called According to Luke. Sometimes you'll see it's called the Gospel According to Luke. You know, famously in the Old Testament, you have the book that we call the Song of Solomon, and it has an alternative title. I'm slipping what it is at this point. Song of Songs, that's another title that it has. And the Hebrews in the Old Testament would often have different titles for books than what we have. So just a quick observation, be reminded that the title at the top of the page is not inspired, but the text, the words of the passage itself are indeed inspired. And you know this because of 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17. What's it say? All Scripture, what's it say? Is given by the inspiration of God, is literally God-breathed. So the words on the page are God's own words. The title has been added to help us understand some context. And so who wrote the book of Luke? We can't just take it for granted. I will say, though, that the earliest fragments of manuscripts that we have discovered attribute way long ago, actually as early as AD 170. Keep in mind that date. That's less than 100 years than the last apostle lived, right? That's about 110 years after we believe the book of Luke was written. So the earliest fragments of manuscripts that we have in our possession in scholarship and museums, we can actually go there and see this actual physical copy dates back to 170. And it says that it has as its title, way back then they were putting titles on it, and it just simply says, according to Luke. And so 170 years after the birth of Jesus, just a little over 100 and so many years after Jesus died, we see that they were calling this gospel Luke and attributing it to Luke. I don't know if this is interesting to you or not, but there was a writer during this period, some call him a church father, we'll use that term loosely. His name is Irenaeus, and he lived from 130 to 202, AD 130 to 202. And he had a work that is widely regarded as a good work of understanding early church history. Not inspired, it isn't the same as the Bible. It's to be viewed as any other book of history, but he has a book or a writing that is entitled Against Heresies. And in book 3 and chapter 1, notice what he says. And this was just, let's say this was about 100 years removed from the original writing of the Gospel of Luke. Irenaeus says, Luke also, and I'm quoting, Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. And so Irenaeus, roughly 2,000 years ago, is saying this gospel account that bears the name of Luke, it was written by him. So this was not something that someone added in 1960s or in 1850s or in, even in the year 1200. This was something that was understood just a generation or so removed from the original writing of the book of Luke. Just a generation or so removed from Jesus walking on the earth. It is attributed to Luke, Paul's companion, by Irenaeus. Also Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Origen, all of these individuals who lived roughly during this same period attributed the book of Luke, as well as the book of Acts for that matter, we'll get to that in a moment, to Luke. So you might be asking, why take time and think about this? Why do we need to concern ourselves with this? There's two reasons. Number one is what we may call textual criticism. I'll come back to that in just a moment. And number two is simply context. Okay, so textual criticism is the critical look of books that are said to be inspired, books that are said to be biblical. We call that the canon. And there's a whole lot of books written out there. Famously, Catholics have a group of books that are not included in our Bible. You remember what those are called, right? The Apocrypha. And the word Apocrypha just means that which is doubted. Books that are in doubt. Books that could have been included according to them, but they were doubtful enough to leave them out. And so we reject them as not consistent enough with New Testament teaching. How do you know which books are inspired and uninspired? How do you know which is the Word of God and which isn't the Word of God? Well, that comes down to the study of textual criticism. It is people who take an extra critical look at hardcore evidence and say, when we claim that the book of Luke, the book of Mark, the book of Matthew, the book of Acts, the book of 1 John, when we claim it is meant to be in the Bible, that it is inspired by God and it's more than the words of mere men, what evidence do we have to support that? What physical, hard evidence do we have to support that? And we won't get into that study now. That's different than what we're trying to do this evening. I rely on the reliable research of those in scholarly fields in academia who can say, we've done the work, here's the evidence, read it, it's tedious if you want to, but the Bible you're reading has all kinds of evidence to support that it's more than just the work of men. A lot of these people who are at our colleges, like Freed Hardeman and Harding and all of these who have these big degrees, and you may wonder, and I've even heard people say certain things in a derogatory way about them, understand they're not in the field of teaching and preaching. Some of them are, Some of them are not in the field of local work in a local church. They're in the field of scholarly research. We call that textual criticism. That's not the work that I do. I'm not capable of doing that. I'm not academic enough. Even if I've tried, that's one reason I'm not a huge fan of a lot of university graduate level classes, because they're less practical and more heady in that they're overly academic. I once wrote a 27-page paper on whether or not the Hebrew word translated Red Sea should be translated Red Sea or Reed Sea. I'm not interested in all that. I'm not. But I'm thankful people are interested in that, and they do the research, and they have data and evidence that back up the reliability of Scripture. And when I open my Bible, I've done just enough study to know that it's reliable, and I want to jump into chapter 1, verse 1 and start hearing from God. That's what I'm interested in. I don't knock those who are in that other field. It's just not the same field, is what I'm saying. A little bit of a soapbox, and I'll say it and get off. In the Brotherhood, we sometimes try to train local preachers as though they're in the field of textual criticism and put them in a church and wonder why they can't connect to people. I'll say that and shut up. There's two different ways of training there. Now, when we look at this, the reason it's important to consider this is because of that. The other is context. If you get a letter in the mail and you start reading it, and you get about a paragraph in and you think, wait a minute, I don't know who wrote this to me. Don't you think who wrote it to you is kind of important? I mean, who they are, the perspective they're coming from, the stage of life they're in, the situation they've experienced in life, your past experience with them, their expertise. All of this really matters, and so it helps to add to the context of the writing. Now, let me get back to this. I said I want to go through this quickly, not to drain the time of class. And so I will just note that nowhere in the book of Luke does it ever say Luke is the writer of this book. You know, some of Paul's letters will say that, right? Paul's writing to a church and he will say, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, so on and so forth. Luke never does that. And you'll actually find out that Matthew never does that, Mark never does that, and John never does that. None of the Gospels say, I identify themselves as the writer of a story and proceed to write the story. I would suggest to you that's purposefully done. Luke is not including his name in the gospel because it's not the gospel of Luke, it's the gospel according to Luke, and the story isn't about Luke, the story is about who? It's about Jesus Christ. And I suggest to you that that's purposefully done. And so what do we know? Since we don't have a name given in the text, what do we know? We know that whoever wrote the book of Luke was not an eyewitness of the earthly ministry of Jesus. That's important. Look at Luke chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. This is not us studying this in detail. I'm just referencing it real quickly. Luke 1, verses 1 and 2. He opens the book by saying, inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those as in other people, who from the beginning of Jesus' ministry, were eyewitnesses. They were there in person, seeing it and observing it with their senses, and ministers of the word, they delivered them to us. He's saying there's two categories of people. There are those who lived and operated and were physically present in the days of Jesus' physical ministry, and there were those of us who heard about it. He's putting himself in the category of those who heard about it. He is not an eyewitness of these events, and we'll talk about this more later. What we do know is that whoever wrote this gospel was not a part of being an eyewitness of the ministry of Jesus. That doesn't diminish this in the least, and I'll tell you why in a bit. Number two, what do we know? We know that whoever wrote Luke was very well educated. You know, people smarter than me who read and study literature for a living, even Greek literature for a living, they will highlight probably 2, if not 3 New Testament books as being literary works, literary master classes of literary achievement. That's a better way of putting it. And number one of those is going to be the book of Luke. Luke, the whole New Testament's written in Greek. And the whole New Testament's written in terms that we can all understand. It's all beautiful messages. But literary speaking, the writing of Luke is extremely advanced. It is sophisticated. It is advanced. He has a bigger vocabulary. He uses it in a way that is that demonstrates he's a more learned and educated man, and far more familiar with the Greek language than someone who's speaking it as a second language or writing it as a second language. And so in Colossians chapter 4 and verse number 14, here's one detail we learn about Luke. You already know this, but let's just get it out in the open anyways. In Colossians 4 and verse number 14, Paul is talking about all of these people that he is greeting the church at Colossae. And he gets down to Luke and Demas and he says, Luke, the beloved, what does he call Luke? In Colossians 4:14, he says, someone else greets you. It is Luke, the beloved, what's he say? Physician. Now, physician is, we know what physician is. It is someone who's trained to be a medical doctor. Well, that meant the same thing then. Here's the unique part that we'll come back to, is that Jewish people, now, stereotypes are stereotypes. Jewish people then were not known to be doctors. They were not known to be physicians, okay? They were known to be lawyers. They were known to be religious leaders. They were known to have all kinds of blue-collar jobs. Physician was a new field. It was a new trade. It was not something that Jewish people dabbled in. It would have been very rare. But you know who was pushing the field of physician then? It was the Greeks and it was the Romans. And we'll come back to that point in just a moment. But he calls Luke a physician. Here's what we know about physicians. Physicians then, like physicians now, had a very high ceiling of academic learning and achievement they had to engage in. Therefore, if Luke was a practicing physician, he had to be smart, he had to be well educated. And so scholars have noted that the writing of Luke emphasizes more than the other Gospels infirmities and illnesses and healings of Jesus, that is physical healings. And they also note that when you compare the illnesses that are spoken of that Jesus healed by miracles, you compare those written by Luke to the other gospel writers, Luke is describing them with greater detail, with greater precision, in more medical-like terms. And so the idea that Luke is the writer of this gospel, and this happens to be the most medically accurate gospel account in referring to infirmities, that kind of adds up, doesn't it? That's what we do know. Here's what else we know. We know that whoever wrote the book of Luke had an excellent, we've already hinted at this, had excellent Greek language skills, probably suggesting that Greek was their first language. That would be a good assumption. Remember, the other apostles like Peter, they were Galileans. They were not Greeks first and foremost. You remember when Peter was at the scene of Jesus and he was betraying Jesus, what did one of the people who asked Peter about Jesus say? They said, you're one of them from Galilee, for your speech betrays you. He spoke with a heavy Galilean accent, which would have sounded like a heavy accent of the blue-collar working class people. It wasn't the sophisticated in the temples, in the public square debating philosophical ideas. It was a working class man's way of talking. And here we see that the writer of Luke, he's actually writing in a highly sophisticated way. He's writing in a highly educated way. Not that it's above the common person's comprehension. He's just using the Greek language in a very, in a way that would not be so much expected by someone who is just a Galilean, for instance. So that's the point. And then I would just note that whoever wrote had this excellent language skills in Greek. Go with me back to Colossians. I think this is important. Colossians chapter 4. We read verse 14. I want to make an observation about Luke that I think is often missed, even in commentaries. In Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10, I want you to read with me and follow the thought that's happening here. He says, Paul is again mentioning several names. He says, Aristarchus, this is Colossians 4 and verse 10, he says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greet you. He's saying this to the church he's writing to. He says, in Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, about whom you received instructions, if he comes to you, welcome him. Verse 11, and Jesus was a common name in that day actually. This is a different Jesus than the one we worship. And Jesus, who is also called Justus, verse 11, these are my fellow workers for the kingdom, who are of the circumcision. What does that phrase mean in the Bible? When he mentions 1, 2, 3, 4 names and he says, these are of the circumcision. What does that indicate? They are Jewish. They are Jews. And he keeps going on here and says they have, verse 11, They have proved to be a comfort to me. Epaphras, who is one of you, a bondservant of Christ, to greet you always, laboring fervently for you in prayers, that you may stand perfect and complete in all of the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has great zeal for you and those who are in Laodicea and those who in Hierapolis. Now he gets back to his list of individuals, and he says, Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas, they greet you also. So he's listing all these people who is greeting them. He puts them in two categories: those of the circumcision, which is a number of names, and then there's another category, and there's Demas and there's Luke. What does that strongly imply? That Luke would not have been a Jew, he would have been a Gentile. And it's worth noting that the name Luke was not Jewish anyways. The name Luke was actually a Greek name. And so I'm not saying I know for certain, but there's all kinds of evidence to support the idea that Luke is not a Jew. And more specifically, he is a Greek, explaining why the book of Luke and the book of Acts are considered to be very masterfully written in Greek. And just as a point of curiosity, that means the single writer who wrote the most of the New Testament wasn't even Jewish. He was a Gentile at least, maybe even a Greek. I find that interesting because there's no other writer of the New Testament that's anything but Jewish. He would be the only one if that's the case. There's some mystery over the Hebrews writer, but you can't read Hebrews and think of anything but Jewish, right? It's steeped in Judaism. And so it's very likely that Luke is the only Gentile writer of the New Testament, and he wrote more than any of them by word count. And so that's what we know for certain. Also, whoever wrote Luke was also the writer of the book of Acts. And I think many of you already know this, but go with me to let's go back to Luke chapter 1. And I want to read Luke's purpose statement, maybe you can call it, in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. We're going to come back and delve into these verses more detailed when we get out of the introductory material. But notice a few points. He says in the opening of Luke, he says, "Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered to them to us," he said, "it seemed good to me also, having had perfect," or we may say complete, "understanding of all the things from the very first." He says, to write to you an orderly account. And then notice this, he writes to an individual who he calls most excellent Theophilus, "that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed." Now, keep that opening in mind and go over to the book of Acts. Acts chapter 1 makes it very clear that whoever wrote the book of Luke also wrote Acts and vice versa. In Acts chapter 1, you remember who he wrote the book of Luke to. It wasn't a church. It wasn't an individual stationed at a church. That's every other book of the Bible except for the Gospels. He writes to a single individual. And as he writes to a single individual, we know his name is Theophilus. And so when you go to Acts chapter 1 and verse 1, he says this time he's writing, and he opens his letter, his book in this way. He says, "The former account I made, and what's the name he uses? Theophilus." Now, it isn't just that we say it's the same writer because he's writing to a guy by the same name. It's also that the very first line of the book of Acts is he's referring to a former account that he had already written to a man by the name of Theophilus. But it gets more detailed than that because he's not just saying, "I wrote to you before, Theophilus," and leaves it blank. He goes on to give these details. He says, "The former account I made, O Theophilus, and here's what I wrote to you about the first time, Theophilus." What's he say? "Of all that Jesus began to both do and teach." And verse 2, "I wrote even about all the days of Jesus' earthly life until the day in which he was taken up." We call that the ascension. What do you call a document that records a great deal of what Jesus did and what he taught and records his ascension into heaven? What do you call that? I call that a gospel, a narrative of the life of Jesus. And so here we have the writer of the book of Acts who makes it abundantly clear that whoever it is that wrote Acts also is the writer of this book called Luke. Therefore, if we're looking for internal evidence as to who the author is, we now have Luke to look at, and we can safely look at Acts, and we can piece some things together. Because of time, I'm not going to get too bogged down into this, and I'm just going to read some points and try not to make this take too much longer. But I'll leave it at this, that when you compare these two, one, they're both written to Theophilus. Two, he references the first account, which is obviously the book of Luke in it. And if we had time, I would just point out that he says in Acts chapter 1 that the first book that I wrote to you has to do with all that Jesus began to both do and teach, and until the day in which he was taken up. It's interesting that not only does the book of Luke include things Jesus did and Jesus taught, but if you look at the very last little bit of the book of Luke, how the book of Luke ends, in Luke 24 verses 50 through 53, he makes it clear that this is, he takes away if there is any doubt. We know all the Gospels end this way. But in Luke chapter 24 and verse 50, the book ends in this way. So he, Christ, led them, the disciples, out as far as Bethany, and he lifted up his hands and blessed them. Verse 51, now it came to pass while he blessed them that he was parted from them and carried up into heaven. And the next verse says they worshiped him after this. And so you can see here that the two books share the same author, the writer. Of course, there used to be a time when I was very particular and used the term human penman. There's nothing wrong with the term author, because we know that every book of the Bible is breathed out by God, and God used various human authors to accomplish that task. Just like he used humans of old to prophesy, just like he uses humans today to evangelize and teach and preach and share the gospel. God still is the power behind the words of the book. And so since the book of Acts documents the travels of the Apostle Paul as well as others, the author of the book of Acts often indicates when he is physically present with Paul. And it's as simple as this. The person writing the book of Acts will talk about all these people and all of these stories, and every now and again he'll use the word we. What does that mean? Well, the person who's writing the book was present at this event. Or sometimes he uses the word us. And so there's a series of famous we statements in the book of Acts. If you're taking notes, we won't look at all of these. In Acts 16:10 through 17, whoever wrote the book of Acts says, we traveled from Troas to Philippi. Okay, so the writer of the book of Acts is with Paul when he makes those travels. In Acts 20, verses 5 through 15, we traveled from Philippi to Troas to Miletus. In Acts 21, verses 1 through 18, we, including the writer of the book, traveled from Miletus to Jerusalem. And in Acts 27, verses 1 through 18, we traveled to Rome. Wait a minute. We traveled to Rome. Why is that significant? Go with me to 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 11. 2 Timothy 4 and verse number 11. Now, this is in the midst of a bigger discussion, but notice the little statement that Paul makes as he's writing to Timothy and closes out his last book that he writes. And Paul is in prison in Rome. And while in Rome, Paul writes, only who is with me? What's your Bible say? Only Luke is with me. Now, I'm not going to be intellectually dishonest here and say that is 100% evidence right there in the text that Luke was the one with him and he's the writer of Acts. And the reason I say that is technically, if you know the story, Paul went to Rome, was released, and then went back to Rome. So we're not exactly sure which Rome visit this was. We know this was his second. But the point is that when you start looking at the evidence for who wrote the book of Luke, well, whoever wrote the book of Luke also wrote the book of Acts. Okay, who wrote the book of Acts? Whoever it was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. I'm getting away from my notes a little bit because of time. Here's what we also know. There's strong indication that whoever wrote both Luke and Acts was not a Jew, because when they described Jewish culture, they described it as though they needed in other words, a Jewish person would mention a Jewish feast day and move on. Luke doesn't do that. He mentions a piece of Jewish culture and then explains what that means, as though he understands he and his audience are not steeped in Jewish culture. Another thing is that when he's using dates in the book of Luke, he uses dates that are significant to Romans, not Jewish people. Chapter 2, verse 1, chapter 3, and verse 1 is an example of that. Another thing is that when he is talking about an Aramaic word, which is the language that the Jewish people spoke originally, he gives the Greek interpretation of that. Jewish writers often didn't do that. They just left it as the Aramaic word. So there's strong evidence that who wrote Luke? Well, whoever wrote Luke wrote Acts. Who wrote Acts? Whoever wrote Acts was a traveling companion of Paul. Strong indication they were a Greek, or at least a Gentile, traveling companion of Paul. You can start ruling people out in Acts chapter 16, 17 through 19. You can rule Silas out, because we is mentioned and Silas is mentioned in addition to we. In Acts chapter 20, verses 4 through 5, you could rule out about 5 or 6 or 7 other names for the same reason. And guess what? You're getting very close to only Luke being left. Luke is clearly the traveling companion of Paul that makes the most sense. And so who is Luke? That's a good way to kind of summarize this point. Luke is a physician, well-educated, highly learned physician. He is a Gentile, maybe, probably even a Greek. He is a second-generation Christian. What I mean by that, not that his parents were Christians, but that he was not a part of that initial stage of followers of Christ. He was taught by someone who, in other words, anyone that Paul taught would be a second-generation Christian, right? And so he was not there as an eyewitness. What else do we know about Luke? He was a devoted and beloved traveling companion of Paul who also labored in the kingdom. He wrote 27% of the New Testament. And to put that in perspective, Paul wrote even less than that at 23%. We have 5 minutes left, so let me get this very quickly in bullet points. When was the book of Luke written? It's important, if you operate on a timeline, it's important to understand this timeline. The writing of the book of Luke does not mention the following, and that's important. Number one, it does not mention the destruction of Jerusalem. When was the destruction of Jerusalem? AD 70. So what's a safe assumption? That the book of Luke was written before there was a destruction of Jerusalem. It was most likely written before AD 70. The book of Luke does not mention the writings of Luke, including Luke and Acts, does not mention the death of Paul. Now, Paul has gotten arrested. He's on house arrest, and the book of Acts ends by saying he's in house arrest, but he's been given free opportunity to preach for 2 years there in Rome. People just have to come to him. It actually ends on a rather optimistic, positive note. What's interesting is it doesn't mention the death of Paul, and we know Paul died somewhere around 65, 66, AD 65, 66, somewhere in there. You know what else it doesn't mention that would be significant? It doesn't mention the intense, severe persecution that came about by the leadership of Nero, and that happened in 65. Therefore, the safest date for the book would be before all of those events, which would just be in the early 60s, and that would be for Luke and Acts, to maybe a few year difference there. And so I would just note that's the date. Now, to whom was it written? We're going to have this discussion in our next class, and so this is going to turn into what I didn't want it to be, but I hope you're gaining something from it. And we need to understand to who the book was written, talk about Theophilus, the audience that this book was written to, and then we will conclude with those 2 points next week. To whom was it written, and for what purpose was it written? And by the end of next week's class, we will cover that, and we will cover the first 4 verses in Luke chapter 1, verse 1, because they're a significant part of this introductory material. So here's what you need to know at this point. The book of Luke is, let me go ahead and get ahead of myself and say this in the last minute or two we have. Matthew is commonly called the gospel that is written to Jews. Okay? Mark is commonly called the gospel that is written to Romans. Luke is called the gospel that was written to Gentiles. And you have John, who it is often said is the gospel written to the world. I think that makes a lot of sense. But if you look at it, if you look at all of the other gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, and John, none of them cover the story of Jesus in chronological order. They cover the story of Jesus in a thematic tone. In other words, they lump themes together. And so when you're reading Matthew, don't assume that this event precedes this event precedes this event. You might be reading something in chapter 15 that chronologically might belong in chapter 7. So understand it's grouped together by themes. That's the case with Matthew, Mark, and John. John's gospel, for instance, is centered around 7 miracles that Jesus performed. There's a miracle, there's a speech, and then there's some healings or something like that. And he lumps it together that way. Well, if you remember in Luke chapter 1, he says in verse number 3, "It seemed good to me, having had perfect understanding of all these things," the very first, "to write to you an orderly account." What he's doing is he's saying, many people before me have written about Jesus, but what I'm doing is I'm going to put it down in chronological order, in an orderly sequential fashion, and we'll talk more about why he does that next week. And so understand that Luke, when you see movies written about the life of Jesus, they follow Luke because it's chronological. It's the only one. And so we'll talk more about this in our next study. Any questions or comments you have at this point? Bear with me as we get through this introductory material, and this will not be the tone of the class going forward. We just want to get this underway. Go ahead, Brother Ed.
I probably won't be here next week. When I read this, I got to verse 3 where Luke says, "He carefully investigated everything."
Yeah.
Carefully investigated. And you said perfectly new. Those added comments were strange to me. I don't know if maybe a writer that said things like that.
So can I tell you what's happening there? You have noticed sometimes that different translations have dramatically different wordings. When they're that dramatic, it isn't a translation difference, it is a difference in the manuscripts that they are using. You know, there's two philosophies. King James, New King James use the philosophy that says whatever the majority say, that's what we're going with. The critical text, which is English Standard, New American Standard, Christian Standard, so on and so forth, what most scholars say is we're not going with what the majority say, we're going with what the older text says. The oldest text we have available, we're going with that because we presume the older it is, the more faithful it is. And so you have two different philosophies, and so in the oldest manuscripts they have available, it says what yours says. What translation are you using?
Well, I read several.
Gotcha. It is, yeah. And then in the majority, it will say what the King James and New King James. So it doesn't change any doctrine, but every now and again it adds some confusion to understanding a biblical passage. Does that make sense? We could discuss that more, but I think you notice something that I noticed too, and it's just something you're going to see when you're using multiple translations. Thank you for your kind attention. We'll pick up here next study. And I encourage you to be reading the book of Luke, getting familiar with it, and growing closer to Jesus. Thank you.